Thank you very much again for the kind introduction. Thank you all for coming out. It's the third and final presentation that I'll be doing with you on this segment. What a pleasure it has been for me, not only to have been on board this ship, but to have met you from all the corners of the world. Most of my clients, I must tell you, are corporate clients. Certainly very few clients have the global breadth of experience that you have as world cruisers. So it is an added pleasure for me to be able to share the material with you. And I know that A, because you come from so many different parts of the world, and B, because you have visited on vacation or even in business, there's an added level, a layer of appreciation and understanding. So I'm privileged to be here and to speak to you. The penalty, of course, in dealing with slightly political material is that one tends to discuss this stuff all the time as I go along the ship. So when was it? 2 days ago, I was sort of meandering through the old town of Riga, and the conversation between myself and guests mutated into Donald Trump. There I was discussing Donald Trump in the old town of Riga, but that's an occupational hazard that I have wherever I am across the world. Now, there have been various themes that I've tried to address in the two prior lectures, and there are no prizes for guessing what the themes are. The themes have been, the big picture themes have been substantial forces we now see across the world that propel us into a volatile and very rapidly changing political, economic, and social environment, and that I kind of covered, I suppose, in that all-encompassing first talk. And then in the second talk, when I dealt more with Europe, that sort of brought to the fore issues of economic stagnation in the developed parts of this world, particularly the European Union, prospects for the future. And again, it contrasted in a sense with the global change, the rising new powers in this world, stagnation to a degree in the West, more in Europe than in the United States, I might add. I'm pleased to say for the Americans here, I'm still relatively bullish about the United States going forward. And then in this third talk, I want to then extend the theme of change to what is termed the BRICS group of countries. Now, I come from South Africa, so South Africa being a member of this particular group of nations has obviously more resonance to me. And I've been with many foreign audiences, and there's a lot of interest in this particular grouping, possibly because the grouping contains the big economies of China and India, and they predominate in this particular group's discussion, and all of what I'm going to discuss about to a degree centers around China and India, and perhaps also to Russia, given that we've been really within the Russian waters and old former sphere of influence. Was there anybody in this room who really was not familiar with the term BRICS? There you go. So there are those who are not familiar with it. And it's interesting because, in a sense, perhaps coming from South Africa, if you're in Brazil, you probably were familiar with it. If you were in other parts of the developing world, you're probably familiar with it. But as it doesn't contain the United States or any of the major Western countries at all, it perhaps is a little bit removed from some of you. And I hope at least to give you some background as to what it really means, and does it have any real significance, because economists around the world and political analysts around the world love acronyms. We just create acronyms all the time. I mean, you could just sort of have an entire lecture just in acronyms. Here's another one, BRICS. So we'll talk about whether this is just a sort of a pleasant grouping of nations that will have any meaningful effect, or is there an undercurrent of political interest in this group that will have a bearing not only on the members of the BRICS group, but clearly on the rest of the world, and in particular, the existing economic powers of the West, the United States, and Western Europe for that matter. So, I saw some of you bringing in cups of what I presume to be coffee or something a little stronger, since this is an all-inclusive cruise, and you may well need it, because, people do say to me, well, what am I going to say today? How am I going to distress you all today? Well, I'm going to tell you about the change that's coming in the world, and how these major new developing countries are going to affect us all. Now, the best way really to sort of introduce this particular topic is just to give you an idea of sort of what groupings of countries mean. We used to have the G7 countries, the G7, and all of you probably were familiar with the G7 group of countries, the US, Japan, Germany, the UK, France, Italy, and Canada, the most advanced, if one might want to say, or the biggest economies in the West plus Japan. And just look at the change. Just look at the change in the gross domestic product that is occurring in our lifetime. And that's the remarkable aspect of the era that we are in. And I keep on saying this to audiences. It's happening around us all the time. GDP growth of the established post-Second World War leading economies of this world, GDP growth, indeed, between 2009 to 2050, these economies will grow and grow relatively substantially in trillions. This is in trillion US dollars, $29 trillion in 2009. The US, Japan, Germany, UK, France, Italy, and Canada will have a combined GDP of about $70 trillion by 2050. But look at this particular little section of this graphic here. These countries, China, India, Brazil, Russia, and I might add 3 countries that are not part of the BRICS group, Indonesia, Mexico, and Turkey. 3 very interesting countries that I'm not going to analyze in any great degree in this talk at all, except to say that they're not part of the BRICS, but they are equally exciting and interesting economies into the future. If we have a look at their combined GDP, look at that figure. From being behind the established Western economies in 2009, look at how these 7 major developing countries vastly overtake in terms of GDP the Western nations plus Japan. And it really gives you an indication of the economic activity and the pivot in this world that we are going to see towards these new players. Now, what has it all got to do with BRICS? Well, the term BRIC, because it started out without the S. The S in BRICS refers to South Africa, which was added on a little bit later, and I'll come to that in a moment. But the term BRIC itself, B-R-I-C, was coined by this particular gentleman, Jim O'Neill from Goldman Sachs. So there you go, a New York banker sitting in his office back in 2001 wanted to describe the fastest and most important emerging economies for the next decade or more. And he sat in his office and he came up with the term BRIC to denote Brazil, Russia, India, and China. Part of the fun of that particular term was that it rolled off the tongue so nicely. It just sounds good when you say BRIC. And I think it's a term that stuck. It's stuck in the minds of so many people, particularly those who are looking to diversify their investment portfolios. And ultimately, that's what good investment bankers really want to do all the time. Monitor where the next good, positive return on investment can be. So Mr. O'Neill, as it happens, coined the term BRIC, and the term stuck. The BRIC countries, Brazil, Russia, India, and China, found themselves in an informal club, merely a descriptive term to indicate the promise that these countries would hold in the future in terms of economic growth. And at the time, of course, of the coinage of the term BRIC 12, 13 years ago, the 4 countries described were, of course, always going through changes. They had different leaders to what they have now, fairly obviously. But clearly, back in 2001, China was well on the rise. India was beginning to emerge. The Russian economy looked a lot better in 2001 than it does now. And the Brazilians were starting to show impressive signs of economic growth and social upliftment for millions of people. And these are big population centers of the world, and each one of these 4 BRIC countries were in a different region or a different continent of the world, so they would almost represent regionally other countries that bordered them or were close to them. And hence, of course, the term really seemed to be a term that would gain traction in the world going forward. About 5 years ago, the BRIC Club was extended to include South Africa, and that's where the S came on to the end of BRICS. It really was convenient because this acronym is such a nice acronym. You wouldn't want to upset the acronym by adding Mexico onto it. For example, how would you pronounce BRIC-M? But if you added South Africa onto the acronym, BRIC became BRICS. And you know, we can joke about how this all came about. Effectively, the original BRIC term was coined by Jim O'Neill. But the addition of South Africa was on the invitation of the existing 4 BRIC countries themselves, particularly China, who motivated for South Africa to be included in this club of nations. And you may ask, well, I would just want to show you a nice little cartoon, because sometimes I like to show cartoons. Here are the 4 pillars, the main pillars, anchors of the BRICS, and there is the little South African joining the BRICS table. The South African referred to not as a brick, but a briquette, largely because the South African economy was much smaller than these 4 giants, also a much smaller population as well. South Africa really embraced the idea of joining China and India and Brazil in a club of economic nations into the future. It enabled South Africa, my homeland for that matter, to punch way above its weight, let me tell you. So South Africans really did embrace this. The 4 BRICS countries themselves, now 5, really denote this. They're the largest, most rapidly developing economies, which will by the year 2050 eclipse most of the wealthiest countries of the world, simply in terms of size of their economies, not necessarily in terms of the wealth of their individual citizens, but there's no doubt that combining China and India and Brazil and Russia, warts and all, and South Africa, although on a much smaller scale, these will be global leaders into the future. And again, when you look at these big numbers that come out of the BRICS nations themselves, take China and India and, of course, the others, but 42% of the world's population is in the BRICS nations. Again, obviously, for goodness sake, it's China and India that play the major part of that. 26% of the world's land territory find themselves in the BRICS nations. These are big nations. And 27% of the world's GDP currently, more or less, comes from these 5 BRICS countries. So you can see that by putting them into some sort of group has got relevance just because of their size, their influence, their growing geopolitical influence, and of course their growing economies as well. South Africa's inclusion in the BRICS was not just a play on South Africa into the future, it was also a play on the importance and rising importance of Africa and the African continent. South Africa was seen as the African representative of the BRICS group. There was a South American representative in Brazil, of course, Asian, Eurasian in Russia. South Africa gave the BRICS group more of a global feel. And again, I must stress the point that South Africa was never part of the original descriptive term of BRICS from Jim O'Neill. It was as a result of the BRIC countries themselves fleshing out this particular association and extending the club of nations to include South Africa. Again, there are a fair amount of graphs, so don't worry too much if you can't see the stuff. I'll just highlight some of the issues here. When it comes to population, as I've indicated, when you've got China at 1.3 billion people and India at 1.2 billion, and India is really going to overtake China by the end of the century in terms of population, you can see the importance of having these two countries in a club of nations. They will be dominant forces into the future. In terms of GDP, certainly for the moment, the Chinese way ahead of the other BRIC nations. So you can see again the importance of China in this particular grouping. In terms of household consumer spending, the red line, these red lines indicate China's dominance amongst the 5 group members. Consumer spending, the Chinese spend the most. So again, China dominant economically. In terms of government spending, the Chinese dominate. In terms of exports, the Chinese dominate amongst this group. In terms of imports, the Chinese dominate in this group. And you can see those skeptics of this group would perhaps suggest that this is really a play on China more than it is about some of the other member countries. But I think that we must look at this as a collective and as a whole. We can talk about some specifics of the various countries, which I will do in the first half of this talk. Again, the BRICS represent an acknowledgement of the rapid rise of these emerging economies to be almost semi-emerged. I mean, they emerge. They're barely developing today. Both India and China really are standalone economies in their own right. What's fascinating just in this particular chart from the Brookings Institute is just to see between 1900 and 1950, the United States grew at about 2.5% per annum for that 50-year period. But China, over this period now that we're in at the moment, 2000 to 2020, over this 20-year period that we are in the middle of more or less right now at the moment, is going to grow at just over 5% per annum on average for 20 years. And India is going to do just about the same. These figures are going to change slightly, and I'll come back to that in a moment. But you can just see that level of growth in a 20-year period. India's growth is a decade later. India's sort of a decade behind China. So India will grow at 5% or more for a 20-year period from now until about 2030. So you can see that very rapid catch-up that these two big players and members of BRICS are performing in the world right now to bring them up to the levels, I suppose, in a sense, of many Western nations. And again, when you look at some of the remarkable figures, and I could go on and on and on about this remarkable growth, particularly of the Chinese economy. China today exports in a single day more than the country exported in the whole of 1978. So when you look at that sort of level of economic change that's occurred in China, sure, this is going to be an interest into the future, notwithstanding the volatility and vagaries of the Chinese economy, which we will come to in a moment. I sometimes like to show this picture when I do talks to government departments, just to show the efficiency, the militaristic sort of rigidity and efficiency of the Chinese factory floor. Look at those workers lined up at the start of the working day. There's discipline for you, I must tell you. It's not only in terms of the factory floor that China has, of course, risen. In terms of providing good education in maths and sciences, both China and India are starting to dominate this planet when it comes to educational outcomes. And I'll come back to this right at the end of the talk as well. It's a very interesting area, and we could do a separate session on the issue of education in especially China and India and the effect that that will have on all of us, I must tell you, into the future. China and India today graduate a combined 500,000 engineers and scientists every year, compared to about 70,000 in the United States. So on a pure numbers game, you can see that in these critical areas of human endeavor, both Chinese and Indian graduates are going to become a lot more part of our discourse, particularly in the corporate world into the future. There are some disputes about the levels of qualification, and I think you can sort of dispute that the levels of qualification are necessarily the same as what you have in the West, but still the numbers game is there for all to see. China, of course, I can talk about at length. India, of course, deserves its place in the BRICS group of nations. It's the world's youngest country. 50% of 1.2 billion people are under the age of 25. It's astonishing. 50% of 1.2 billion under the age of 25. And, you know, already, there are about 550 million teenagers in India alone. 500 million teenagers in India. What a market. If you're in Levi jeans or iPads or stuff like that that teenagers want, that's where your market will be. And for those of you that are looking to make a little play in investments, you know, whoever can make acne cream for the Indian market has to be a pretty good stock to look at into the future. It's not just about sort of that great demographic that's coming on stream in India. It's about leadership, and a lot of issues around the world center around quality leadership and the positive sentiments that quality leadership can imbibe not only domestically, but also amongst foreign investors. India's got this in abundance for the moment, at least. It has a new leader, Mr. Modi. And Mr. Modi is embarking upon a substantial liberalization of the labor movement in India, which is not easy, to make Indian labor more competitive with a rising China. So there's a degree of rivalry, clearly, in terms of manufacturing costs and input costs and the regulatory environment between India and China. But we are starting to see India look as though they will incentivize more foreign investment. They have to also kickstart or reinvigorate the Indian economy and improve, of course, their manufacturing sector. And this will make India, if Mr. Modi gets this right, and I tell you, I wouldn't want to be the leader of a 1.2 billion population country. I must tell you, that's a headache and a half. But if he does get this right, at least to some degree, India will be substantially more competitive into the future and may well give China a run for its money. And on that particular issue, if we look at the charts to have a look at GDP performance, now, I put charts up on the screen, and I use statistics, and I use this measurement, the gross domestic product. And all of you know the US has been running at about a 3% gross domestic product. Europe's been running at about 1.5%. China's GDP is put today at about 7% GDP. There is a dispute about these figures. There is a dispute as to whether one should use GDP as a good measurement of whether a country is successful or not. And frankly, there is a dispute about whether the statistics that we get from these countries are actually accurate. Are the Chinese really running at 7% GDP? I've got colleagues who say, nonsense, the Chinese are actually running at a much softer GDP than 7%. And there is a suspicion about some of these official statistics, but I have to work with official statistics. In my business, I have to work with authoritative research houses, and the research I present to you really is based upon that. I can't thumbsuck a guess on where that Chinese economy really is at. But what we can do is that we can plot the official statistics from China and India, and what we can see is that the lead that China has had, that lead that the country has had in GDP is starting to wane. As you can see, that GDP graph is down. And look at the Indian GDP. We're starting to see Indian GDP rise and meet, if not overtake, Chinese GDP. So, you know, I'm a bit of an Indian bull into the future, I must tell you, but I tend to be sort of 10 or 20 years ahead of my time. That's why I never make money doing these things. I need to fast forward myself, and then I really might be quite successful in what I do. India, of course, as we know, has become a country of great economic success. It is also developing domestic brands, and there's a similar characteristic between India and China. A lot of money is being poured into the development of domestic brands or businesses that have global outreach. And many of you are going to become familiar with many of these brands. Some of you already are. I'm sure you all know about Tata Motor Vehicles. In fact, Tata has got interest in just about every single possible industry. And all of these are going to become household names for all of us across the world. I always like to look at some of the brands that the Indians have been buying because countries buy brands. The Indians have been buying some of the great brands that were English, British brands. I sometimes refer to it as the Empire Strikes Back. The Indians have bought Land Rover. Land Rover and Jaguar motor vehicles are now Indian-owned. Tetley tea bags, it doesn't get more English than that, back under Indian control. Again, showing what a change there is in the world, that these iconic British brands are now in the hands of the former British Empire, to use that particular term. The same applies to the Chinese to a greater degree. All of you are familiar to a degree with some of these big brands. And where the Chinese are unable to develop their own brand, which is increasingly rare, I must tell you, they will buy into another brand that is established, like IBM's computer division, which then became Lenovo. But the Chinese are making superb electronics right now, and some of you will be aware of Huawei, a company that I'm very familiar with, who has tentacles throughout the developing world and literally is going to put a modem and technology in the homes of just about everybody in the developing world. So watch out for these brands. They're going to come, and you're going to see them all over the place. So in broad terms then, why do I like the BRICS group of nations? Because they're big, because they combine a large proportion of the world's population, and of course they have a very large combined GDP, which makes them significant across the world. The different countries of the BRICS themselves have different attributes. China and India are dominant in the supplies of manufactured goods and services. Brazil and Russia dominate in the supply of raw materials. Raw materials controversial today because the commodity prices have reduced substantially, affecting these two countries' economies, which I'll also come to in a moment. Brazil is dominant in soy and in iron ore, whilst Russia, of course, has natural gas and oil. You've seen in the course of the last few days the Russian dominance in the gas stations, the petrol stations or gas stations that you've seen, and you've seen the way the Russians, through this oil, have been able to retain a degree of power and influence, particularly over this part of Central Europe, the former republics, and for that matter, even into Western Europe. The BRICS have what I call a virtuous cycle between them. The demand for commodities and building materials in China and India injects money into the economies of Russia and Brazil, because the Chinese certainly go to Brazil, they go to Russia, and the Chinese come to South Africa and other parts of Africa for their raw materials to boost their own economy. So the BRICS are starting to work and look inwards, to trade inwards with each other. And those contracts, those big infrastructure contracts that the Chinese require to drive their economy, are now being effectively pushed into other BRIC countries. So they are serving themselves and, of course, enriching themselves in the process. Infrastructure spending in China and India, and we'll get that infrastructure spending coming through in India just a little bit later, but I think it's going to begin, means a very high investment in commodities around the world. Brazil will be will be receptive to those commodity investments, as will my home country of South Africa. These countries are now feeding off one another for goods and services, for commodities, for extractive commodities, and this, of course, keeps their economies, in a sense, relatively buoyant. The BRICS nations hold about 41% of total global foreign exchange reserves, but again, most of that, in fact, is in China. And if you just look at the investment projected in infrastructure for these BRICS countries over the course of the next few years, about $22 trillion need to be invested, particularly by China and by India, and for that matter, by Brazil. It's countries that are attracting business because of this need to upgrade their infrastructure into the future. It makes them a very strong set of nations. And my little country of South Africa really adds to this, because South Africa is the world's richest country in terms of mineral reserves. So you can imagine, to be able to trade with a country that is the richest in terms of its mineral reserves will provide the big Chinas and Indias and Brazils of this world with the necessary minerals into the future to expand their particular industries. Again, the BRICS are important because of their consumer base and the changing nature of the consumer, as I mentioned in my first talk. And we can see and we can plot here on this particular graph consumption patterns in the world over the course of a 50-year period from 2000 to 2050. And you can just see how consumption patterns are changing. Middle class consumption, this is Indian middle class consumption, starting from almost a zero base in 2000 and becoming one of the core consumer markets by 2050. The same can be said for China, I must tell you. And you can just see here, since I spoke about the European Union, you can see how the consumer base of Europe starts to shrink over this period of 50 years and gets transferred to these big Chinas and Indias here. It's a very important graph, that, and that's of course why so many businesses are looking to expand elsewhere. Again, the BRICS are going to be important because consumers are out there. Car ownership in the next 10 years or so is going to be predominantly BRICS driven. To use a good term, BRICS-driven car ownership. I must use that more often. China is going to be the country with the largest amount of cars, car ownership in China. The US will be second. But look at that. Brazil will be third. Well, Russia is going to be fourth, although I'll tell you, this projection, which was done before Russia's current economic woes, might push Russia a little bit further down the line. You can imagine, with the ruble being devalued as it is, and the Chinese and the Russian economy in the state that it is, this will affect vehicle sales in Russia going forward. Nevertheless, it gives you an idea. If you're selling BMW vehicles, where are you going to be selling it? You're going to be selling it in China. I have those figures because I did some work for BMW not too long ago, and I'm not going to show it here, but it's astonishing how BMW have become reliant upon the growing Chinese market. The BRICS countries themselves, don't worry about Tim's graphs here, just listen to me what I'm saying. The BRICS countries themselves are shifting their exports, more and more of their exports, to other emerging markets. So they are locking in countries outside of the BRICS club into being part of their sphere of influence. And this is very important. Countries next to South Africa certainly are reliant upon South Africa. Countries next to Brazil and into Central America in particular, reliant upon Brazil. So these BRICS countries are starting to put out sort of feelers and tentacles into other parts of the world, and they are exporting more and more, of course, to their own BRICS counterparts as well. And the upward trend in all of these graphs simply represents how China is exporting more to other BRICS countries, how Russia is exporting more to other BRICS countries. The trade agreements that now exist between the BRICS countries themselves, very substantial. I think you've got the picture that China is the dominant player here. And China really is pretty dominant all around. I just want to quickly show you how much of the commodities of this world are taken by China or used by China. I mean, China use about 53% of all cement in the world is used by China. 46% of all pig products in this world used by China. 37% of all eggs consumed in China. So you can just see that countries that have become very reliant on China, as it happens, are the ones with the most to lose if the Chinese economy does falter and does splutter, as we are sort of seeing at the moment. Now, I've already mentioned to you that the Chinese economy has had a downward path over the last few years, and this little graph here indicates a little more clearly, growing at 13, 14% back in 1993, 94, 95. Drops, again, fantastic growth up here for China at 13%. But look at that drop. We're seeing a steady trend line drop to China's official figure of 7% right now. Credit Suisse came out with a very interesting, more long-term projection of Chinese growth. And I think this is the most realistic projection that I've seen of where China will be over the course of the next 10, 20 years or so. From a current average, let us say, of 7% growth, Credit Suisse are projecting the Chinese economy to really slow down to about 4% over that period from 2020 to 2029. And I think those are much more realistic figures than this 7% that we are seeing right now from China. So look, across the board, most economic indicators show a downward drift for the Chinese economy. Industrial production is down. Chinese exports are starting to falter. as you can see, they've become more expensive of late, and it's one of the reasons as to why the Chinese, whilst we have been on this cruise, have allowed their currency to effectively be devalued by about 3 to 4%, which has rocked the markets, as those of you know, over the course of the last while. It's terrible for me to be the tidings of all of this sort of reality when you're here on a sort of a fantasy journey on a cruise ship. But for goodness sake, I bring a touch of reality, sadly to say, back to all of us who watch our own stock portfolios. It doesn't matter where you are in the world. You will have been affected over the course of the last week by this volatility as a result of the Chinese economy. Chinese retail and industrial output, look at those trend line graphs, also looking rather dismal for the Chinese. And what's a very important issue for the Chinese that's not often spoken about is that it's costing more to manufacture goods in China. Chinese workers are demanding more. So you can just see that the input costs to make goods in China is rising, and therefore it becomes relatively important for the Chinese to remain globally competitive, to allow their currency to float a little more downwards, as they have done over the course of the last few days. I think the Chinese are masters at manipulating their currency. They are masters at letting the currency settle at an acceptable level. And my own view on this is that I think we've seen the worst of the volatility. It's certainly for the moment. Markets have recovered as yesterday, as you may have seen. I think they will continue to recover in the next week or so as a result of this. But the point one needs to make about China is that it is not a free market capitalist economy. It has a high level of state control, and it is experimenting with different aspects of the market economy. It's a hybrid system. And in a hybrid system, you are going to get high degrees of volatility across the board at regular intervals as this Chinese model mutates into the future. So all I can say, fancy economists come and tell you things, expect great volatility on this Chinese economic story that we are seeing, and you've seen it now. The Chinese currency, as we know, has been devalued. This will make exports cheaper for the Chinese, and of course this affects businesses across the world as a result. It makes the Chinese more competitive when they were becoming a little less competitive, and that's really what I think this has been all about. So the BRICS countries themselves, China, let's put China aside for a moment. Brazil certainly, South Africa certainly, and Russia certainly are reliant not so much on manufacturing, but they're reliant upon commodities, what they take out of the ground, extractive industries. And all of you know who've been watching your stock portfolios, or if you have investments in commodities, in energy, in agriculture, and particularly in metals, in gold, for example, you've seen a decline in the price of commodities over the course of the last year, 15, 16 months. It's quite a steep decline in the price of commodities. And as you can imagine, if you have a country that is reliant upon what you take out of the ground, well, this is going to affect your own economy. Russia's GDP has declined. It's a dismal story for the Russian economy, largely because of the price of oil, but certainly for political factors as well. Sanctions on Russia certainly don't help. Running a war in the Ukraine certainly doesn't help, and we see very poor GDP results coming out of China. Russia. Russia faces both energy and population depletion over the course of the next 50 years, which will compound economic woes in that particular country. And I must say I'm somewhat more bearish on somewhat more bearish on Russia as it happens because of these big picture issues that I've spoken about into the future. Brazil, part of the group, also had a great decade, Brazil, from 2000 to 2010. Fantastic decade of uplifting millions of people out of poverty. But Brazil today has its own set of difficulties. High inflation, high interest rates. The commodity slump is seriously affecting Brazil. Its currency has also depreciated, and there's a high degree, that should be Petrobras down there. There's a high degree of corruption in certain aspects of the Brazilian economy, which doesn't help. And I can tell you in many of these countries, there's a high degree of corruption, which sets back the economy as well, not least my own country of South Africa. So the gloss of the BRICS is starting to wane just a little bit. Russia under pressure, Brazil under pressure, the South African GDP as well, oh dearie me, taking a little bit of a nosedive down there as well because of domestic policy issues, politics, and those bad commodity prices affecting our economy. We've got electricity problems in South Africa that disrupt the supply of electricity, and you can imagine you run a big mine and you don't have enough power to use on a daily basis. That's not exactly something that will make you particularly productive. So the BRICS group are starting to show signs of vulnerability. Vulnerability, this great group. And again, just very, very quickly, you can just see these are the 5 BRIC countries, and you can just see the reliance upon commodity exports of the 5 BRIC countries, Russia being the most reliant upon commodity exports. No wonder its GDP looks bad. Brazil too, no wonder it's almost in recession. South Africa also, no wonder it's struggling with its GDP. India does not rely to the same degree on commodity exports, which assists the Indian economy in riding out this current level of commodity volatility in the world. So, gosh, you're going to be kind of sort of bamboozled by all of the graphs that I put in front of you. Don't worry again too much about it. All I will show you, the red line is China. You can just see the growth projections of China starting to decline a little bit. This is India, the growth projections of India looking a little bit better. And again, you can see the rest, Russia falling into negative GDP growth rate territory there. Just gives you an indication that the BRICS countries are not cohesive. They are showing signs of major economic divergence as it happens because of their own individual positions. So, a few years ago, when the BRICS started to look not as rosy as they were, when Mr. Jim O'Neill first coined the term, Mr. O'Neill sat in his office in New York and he thought, well, gosh, my famous BRICS countries are not looking so good. Let me come up with another acronym of another group of countries that might actually be the next best thing to BRICS. And he developed the term MIST, the MIST group of countries: Mexico, Indonesia, South Korea, and Turkey. There you go. When one acronym doesn't quite make it, it's good to come out with the next one. And all of these 4 countries, I must say, I mean, seriously, have been great performers over the course of the last few years. Some of them looking better than others, fairly obviously. But they might give the BRICS a run for their money in terms of economic growth into the future, growing consumer bases certainly as well. So, look, where do we go from here? Is China on a downward path? Can they continue to grow that economy? Yeah, I actually think what we're seeing at the moment is volatility as a result of, as I've indicated, a nascent hybrid state free market system that is developing in a very messy fashion in China. The Chinese, in the medium to longer term, still, I believe, will be a growing economy of substantial importance in the world. The Chinese are not only worried about domestic issues, their outreach globally and in the region around China in Southeast Asia means that they are establishing tentacles in global banking. They are participating and establishing what's called an Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank for Southeast Asian countries who need loans to build infrastructure. And this is going to be headquartered in and around China to give China substantial power. There's a fund called the Silk Road Infrastructure Fund. I like the name Silk Road Infrastructure Fund, actually. And China is participating in this also to extend its sphere of influence. The Shanghai Hong Kong Stock Connect, what it's called, is going to connect these 2 massive stock exchanges into a powerful financial hub as well. So, you know, yeah, it looks a downward spiral for the Chinese economy for the moment, but that's the vagaries of what this hybrid experiment with the market is going to produce for that economy. So, in the last little part of this particular talk, and I've got about 2 minutes to do the most important part of the talk, are the BRICS really that relevant for all of this? Are they all just sort of 5 different countries, different stages of development, with their own 5 different sets of immense problems? Well, what have the countries done to make themselves more important as a collective? They've got together. It's not just Jim O'Neill in New York describing the importance of BRICS. These BRICS countries like the fact that they have been singled out as crucial players into the future, and they now meet on an annual basis at BRICS summits in any one of the 5 member countries to flesh out interests of common concern. They are, in fact, providing some sort of alternative to the Western institutions created after the First and Second World War. The Bretton Woods agreements, which are now being seen as Western-inspired instruments of financial control, are starting to be tackled by the BRICS group of nations. The BRICS group see the IMF and the World Bank, for that matter, as Western entities that don't have the interests of the developing world at heart. And this grouping has got together to be almost an alternative power source in the world to the West. They see a new opportunity in the world, a common ground for a multipolar world, a world where there are new powers out there who want to really provide an alternative to what the West has been saying. It's a very interesting description, I might add. I'm going to be closing in a minute or two, but a very interesting description of the BRICS. And I think this is from a Russian point of view. So it's interesting to see how the Russians see the BRICS. The emergence of BRICS means an application for the formation of an alternative center of global influence in the arsenal of those countries, the majority of the world's population, and an increasingly weighty share of the world economy. In the case of the expression of common will, the growing power of the BRICS countries can become a serious obstacle to the establishment of a new colonial model of the world. So you see, for the Russians, who'd never really bought into the fact that they would be almost second-class citizens once they lost their Soviet empire after 1989, the BRICS provides a very attractive political home for them. The Chinese, who don't necessarily buy into the Western model of certainly political control from the West historically, also find this quite attractive. The Brazilians, too, who have a left-of-center political background, certainly the regime in power at the moment does, it appeals to that particular group as well. And to my country in South Africa, who also have a skepticism for the West historically, the BRICS groupings finds itself an attractive group in which to operate. So I think you can get an idea that this is a political force. It's not just an economic force with big picture issues of land and population and GDP. There's a philosophical resonance to the BRICS members themselves, so much so that they're about to launch their own BRICS Development Bank as an alternative to the World Bank, and they will offer the chance to poorer countries of this world to come to their bank to ask for loans. This locks poorer countries into a new sphere of influence. It's a very important change that we're seeing in the world. So it's quite a puzzle when you take these 5 countries. Can they agree on much? What they agree on is that they don't necessarily like Western dominance in the world. But what they don't agree on is how to react collectively to major global problems, foreign policy issues, and assorted crises. There's no agreement between the 5 countries on dealing with human rights issues, on dealing with problems in Syria, on dealing with problems of terrorism. There's no such agreement at all. And some of these BRICS countries will continue to enjoy their own specific relationships with the West, notwithstanding their appeal towards this new powerful entity in the world called BRICS. So again, not that much cohesiveness, even though the philosophy certainly is one of providing an alternative to Western power. So what are the BRICS going to do in future? Can they continue to influence the world globally? Well, they're going to try and they're going to lock more developing countries into their sphere of influence. So expect that into the future. Secondly, the BRICS have been more successful on having cooperative agreements when dealing with issues like intellectual property rights, agriculture, climate change policies. There are a lot of meetings between the BRICS countries to flesh out these agreements. But really, the BRICS have not been able to reform, in their terms, the international financial architecture that they would like to. But they're going to give it a shot with this BRICS development bank that is already being established, I must tell you. The jury is out on whether the big BRICS partners like China and India will really cooperate. Will they be friends or will they be competitors? I suspect they're going to be more competitors than friends in the future, because competition to me is the real buzzword of the future. And sometimes the BRICS do get together and they try to discuss replacing the US dollar as the world's reserve currency. And it always comes up on the agenda, but they're certainly very far away from even getting this discussed on a global platform. The Chinese, as I indicated earlier, certainly have taken the path of advertising their currency as an alternative, let us say, to the US dollar. So they're a far way away from that. Finally, I'll show you a cartoon. Now, it doesn't necessarily epitomize my story about the BRICS, but it does epitomize my broad theme of how competitive the world is becoming. Change and competition to me are the key issues. And this final cartoon is a cartoon set in the United States, but frankly we could say it's set somewhere in a Western country, And in the 1950s, a father might have sat down for a meal with his little son, and in somewhere in the West, whether it's in the UK or in the US, and the father would have said to his son, "Son, be sure to finish your dinner. There are children starving in China and India." Starving was the threat to get the kid to eat. It might have been said even in my country. My mother might have said, "There are children starving in the rest of Africa, so eat your food." Now, look how the position has changed today. And I'll give you the cartoon set in today's times. Here in the West, a father may say to his son, "Son, be sure to finish your homework. There are children studying in China and India." From starving to studying. That's the transition that we've seen in the world over the course of the last while. I might add, there are children studying not only in China and India, but in parts of Africa. And it provides us, for those of you from the Western background, with greater competition from elsewhere. It provides me in the developing world with a great sense of hope that the developing world is in fact going to be a major player into the future for the betterment of the planet. Not for nasty competitive reasons, but for the betterment of millions of people who are emerging out of poverty. So in case you think I'm the tider of bad news in all the presentations that I do, don't see this as an attack on the West. See it as an attempt to uplift the lives of people across this planet like never before. And perhaps that's the real opportunity for all of us. We're moving into an era where these millions and billions of people who had little opportunity are now at least being presented with some sort of improved living conditions amongst these BRICS countries. And on that basis, I like the BRICS. But I caution that we're seeing a shift in power. Political power is shifting. Economic power is shifting. And how this plays itself out in the world will no doubt give me more work to do and more clients in the future. Thank you very, very much for listening to me. Follow me on LinkedIn and Twitter, and I'll answer any questions afterwards as we leave. Thank you for staying with me during the lecture.